When the war started, I was 17 years old. I was with my mother and sister living in Cebu City, and I was a high school student. My sister was 4 years younger than I, and my mother was teaching school. The day after we learned that war had started, all normal life came to an end. No more school. I never saw my classmates again. We remained in Cebu City, and all communication had been cut off. My father was living on another island, and there was no way of communicating with him. We had no car. We always used the public transportation, the transit or bus, or a tartanilla, a horse-drawn vehicle to get around, but usually we just walked. And my sister went up on the hillside overlooking Cebu City to stay with some American friends who had a home up there, while my mother and I remained in the city. And my mother, being a school teacher, was told that she and all the other teachers, public school teachers, should report, although the students didn't go to school, the teachers should report, and they should do some work making bandages and preparing for whatever would be needed in case of an invasion. We listened to the radio, and we were very concerned about how things were going. And I kept a diary. I had kept a diary before the war. I don't know if this is interesting to you, but I was someone who liked to write. I can write better than I can speak, incidentally. So even about 3 years before the war, I was keeping a daily diary, and I continued to do this, describing my feelings and how it was. Here I was, not in school with my classmates. I was the only American in my high school. And there was only one girl who was an American living in Cebu City who was close in age to me. All the others were small children. About the middle of December, of course the war started on December the 8th because of the international date line, and it was a Monday, not a Sunday, as it was when Pearl Harbor was hit. And about the middle of the month, I can't tell you exactly when the Japanese began to bomb Cebu City. They were bombing other places like Iloilo, and of course where the fighting was occurring on Luzon. And my mother thought it would be best for my sister to be with Americans who were up on a hillside, and they had small homes, not like cottages, but little houses, where it was cooler. So Catherine went up to be with friends, and my mother and I remained out in the city. And we would report to work to do Red Cross work, and then it was time, Christmas was approaching, and some friends said, do spend Christmas with us. Come out on Landon Heights, as they called it, and have Christmas with us. So my mother and I went with some friends in their car up on the hillside overlooking the city. Well, we had had blackouts before this all occurred. In fact, we had practiced blackouts when it was against the law to show any light. We had learned how to conceal our lights in our house. And so the city was all blacked out, and I said, well, look at the stars. They're the only light we see, or maybe the moon. You could see all the stars in the sky. It was so dark. We're up in there, up in Landon Heights, living with a family that had 2 small children, 2 little girls, and their parents had ordered Christmas gifts, as many American families did, from Sears, Roebuck, or Montgomery Ward. They'd gone through the catalogs, and the gifts had arrived. And Christmas morning, my sister and I decorated a tree, no pine tree, but just a tree, and we cut out paper ornaments, and we decorated this tree. And then Christmas morning, the little girls opened their gifts. And they had received 2 dolls from the States, beautiful dolls. They were so excited. That evening, an American soldier came up the hillside, and he came to us and he said, "There's been an order given for everyone in Cebu City to evacuate the city, except people who are needed for defense, the military, nurses, doctors, civil defense workers, and so on, but others must leave." So we had no choice. The next day, the 26th, we got in cars. The people who lived up there or had homes up there came down the hillside, and we were with the Johnson family, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson and their 2 little girls, Patty and Jackie. And we stopped at my house, just long enough. It was a rented house. We didn't own it. And my mother and I went in quickly, and we had a suitcase, and we quickly grabbed a couple of changes of clothing and toothpaste, toothbrush, and comb, and so on, put them into the suitcase. And then within about 10 minutes, we're back in the car, and off we went. And we went north. And we didn't know where we were going, but it was an incredible sight. When I think of some of the scenes that I've seen recently, with the wars that are going on in the Balkans and so on, and I see the streams of refugees, I could relate to that. Because here are all these Filipinos leaving, some pushing their only belongings in carts, some on bicycles, some carrying things on their head. They're just streaming out of the city. You didn't see too many cars, because cars have been, the word is commandeered, right, by the American Army or the USAFI, and they needed these cars. So we had this car, and so we drove and kept on going and going up toward the northern part of the island. Cebu City, a very, very long island, and rather mountainous in the center. And you could see, at one point, you could look on both sides and you could see the ocean. We finally came to a sugar central, which is a sugar plantation, and there was an American there who had sent his family home before the war, when things were impending. The war, things didn't look too good, and we sort of descended upon him. Maybe as many as, 15 families. And there were 2 houses on this sugar plantation. He was very accommodating. He said, "Oh, come on." And we put mothers with small children in one little house, and then the rest of us stayed in his home. And we slept on the floor, and then we lived there for a while. We were pooling our money and going, and then we would obtain food, which was very readily available at the markets nearby. We stayed there. But now and then we go back down to Cebu City to get some supplies. I would go with my mother, and at that time, I won't mention this, but there were about 2 or 3 times when I went back when there were air raids, and we were caught in the middle of it, and it was kind of scary. Japanese planes strafing us and bombing the waterfront. There are other things I haven't told you, that I had that I had worked for the American Army on the waterfront just prior to going up on the mountainside. I was working with a couple of other American women. I was just a teenager, but I wanted a job. And it didn't last long because it was too dangerous. The Japanese were bombing the waterfront all the time, and that's where I was. Well, go back to the Sugar Central. We stayed there until and my mother continued to go to the school, the barrio school, where we would continue to roll bandages and so on. And we met a Filipino school teacher there. His first name was Paulino, and he taught in the barrio, and we became very good friends. Now there was a talk of building an airfield near Medellin. That would make it rather dangerous for us to remain in the Sugar Central, so we had to decide what to do. So it was decided that we would build some nipa huts in the hills, and we would remain there. So we found a place where there was a source of water, spring, good water, and we moved what possessions we had into that area, and we We paid Filipinos to put up sawali and bamboo and nipa thatch roof, and we built these little huts, and we lived there. We stayed there, and occasionally we'd go back down to the city. The American Army would send up a truck, and we would get in the truck, and we would go down to the city to get some things we needed from our own homes. Now we hear that things are going very, very badly. And we hear of some of our friends who have been killed. The father of one of my best friends in school was killed on Bataan. And that was very sad to hear these things, and we're listening. We want to communicate with our relatives in the United States. How are we going to do it? I managed to send out one postcard via submarine, and it got to my uncle. That was a miracle. And I have that postcard at home. Now we hear that they're bombing Corregidor. The fighting on Bataan is getting very difficult, and we're wondering when aid will come. Then we hear the news on the radio, Bataan has fallen. What radio did we use? We used a radio that was powered with a truck battery, and we had built kind of a mess hall in the hills, and we would again take turns preparing the food and buying from the local markets nearby. And when we heard that Bataan had fallen, we heard people, the Filipinos all around, saying, Bataan has fallen, Bataan has fallen, and our hearts sank. We remained there, knowing that the Japanese had invaded Cebu the day after, on the 10th of April, 1942. And it would be only a matter of time before they would find us. It was about the 30th of April.
Jane?
Yes.
No, this is such a good story. I'm thinking that...
Jane, you're going too long, honey.
No. This is absolutely fascinating. But
Jane, I'm going to have to go back to the car and get my coat out of there.
Okay.
And,
I'll hurry it up.
I'll hurry it up.
are you coming back? Will you be back here before we have to head downstairs?
Yes.
Good. You will be our...
I left one key over here, Jane, but you want your time now because
I know.
It's already about 25 after.
Okay.
Okay, be back.
Yeah, it's just that
Yeah.
I realized...
I'm getting too long-winded.
No, and the light was too harsh on your face. And that's why I moved this, because I like to be,
Okay.
to
All right, I'm going to make it short now.
see your face. No, it's, and just the thing that you're telling, that the Japanese are, much better.
Okay. No.
I
can do it. I can do it
You're
over
in the
again.
hills, and you've built this mess hall, and you have this radio that runs on it.
Yeah.
Start with that, with that story.
Our bags.
Back up a little
Yes.
bit.
Uh-huh.
Okay. They took us through the city of Cebu.
All right. And to show us their hateful scorched earth policy, they blamed it on us when it was really they who had done the damage. And then to this compound, it was called the Presbyterian Church compound, just a small church with two buildings on either side, dormitories. And that's where we saw our friends, the Navy men who had been checking on our welfare, sitting there. And the Japanese asked us to open up our bags, whatever we had. My mother's sister and I had only one suitcase, small suitcase. Opened it up, they searched through. They took things like flashlights. And if they saw any weapon, which they didn't find. And then they said, now we'll take you to your concentration camp. And we went into trucks, and they took us to a house. There were two large homes. One was the British consul's, vice consul's home, and then across the way was another house. They'd already taken several people prisoner, including several Norwegian sailors whose ship had been bombed the first day of the war, and these men had been stranded in Cebu. And again, we sleep on the floor. And the next day, the Japanese say, well, we'll take you to your new place. So, again, we're on trucks. And some of the men walk, and they take us to the Cebu provincial jail. It's a building that was an old Spanish prison, probably built in the late 1500s, with a high wall around it, indescribably dirty, filthy, with one pump that didn't work in the center of the courtyard, and cells, and that was to be our place, our home, so to speak, for at least 2 to 3 weeks. And there were some slap beds there. They were full of bed bugs. And no lights in the city, no water except a pump that didn't work, but someone was able to, a couple of our men were able to get it so that it would give us some water. Water was polluted, we knew that. Now we rely on our Filipino friends to bring us food. And a couple of the people in Cebu had servants who were very loyal Filipinos. And they said, that we will help you, and they would come to the gate. We pooled our money again. Those who had money gave, we pooled it all. Some people had no money, and others did. We shared, and that's how we survived. No one kept any food for himself. It was all shared. If we had clim, dried skim milk, dried powdered milk, it was given to the children, and even a little bit to the adults. And we tried to clean up the place as best we could. We ate off of tin plates that had been thrown on the ground by prisoners who had been there previously. Little water, and really no soap to speak of. So when we washed our clothes, we would pass on the water to someone else to use, and so on. So that's the way things were. And then the Japanese sentries were always walking along the top of the wall, looking down on us. Every night, every hour, on the hour, the Japanese soldiers would come in at night after we were in the cells, and they would shine their flashlights on us and count us. Women and children in one cell, men in another, and then across the way was still another cell where some of the men were. And then above, on some steps leading up, was a cell, which was the hospital of the jail, a small jail. And there's where mothers with tiny children were. It was very hot. The month of May is the hottest month of the year in the Philippines. So we're just lying in these cells with high windows, barred windows, gates clanked shut, and unable to sleep when you're interrupted by Japanese soldiers counting you all through the night. No place for the children to play, just the courtyard was just dust, no shade, sun beat down on us, and we would just sort of follow the wall to get the shade that it cast. And again, very difficult to obtain food. The Norwegian sailors were really wonderful. They were young men, and we had the ship's cook, Peter Einarsson, and he did a lot of the cooking, and these akawas, or the native cooking vessels, large ones, and we cooked the food using wood, open fires, and we didn't have much food at all. It was very starvation, really. A little rice and whatever our Filipino friends could find in the burned city. And one time they came in with some carabao bones, little meat on the bones, so we had that added to the soup, and that tasted so good. And to wash the dishes or plates was difficult, so we let the sun disinfect the cups, the tin cups and the enamel plates. Now the military.
Jane.
Yes, I'm going too far.
No. Harriet wanted to know, were you ever scared that the Japanese were going to hurt you?
All
Again,
right.
incorporate that into your
Okay, I'll do that.
because it's a good time. I mean,
Yes, all right. All right.
Because it's in addition to just
Sure, all right. Okay. Now the military have been told to surrender. And it's about, I'm trying to think of the exact date. Perhaps they have to all surrender by the 16th of May. And one morning, all of a sudden, there's a commotion at the gate, and here come some of our military friends. And they have been either captured or surrendered. They come, and the Japanese had made a mistake of opening up the double gates of iron. There were there was a set of cells apart from us. We were in the section where there was a dusty courtyard. And we rushed up to them, and the Japanese soldier said, "If you talk to them, I will shoot you." "I hope so." And we all fell back. And then the military soldiers, Navy men, were put in separate cells from us, and we had to have a schedule, because when they would go to cook their food, then we had to be in the cells, so we would not communicate with one another. And the same thing is true. There was a little, what they call a baño, which is just a makeshift place where you could take a bath, or actually you didn't take much of a bath because you didn't have that much water, you just had a bucket. And when they used that, then we had to be in cells. At night we would sit, it would be so warm before curfew. Incidentally, we did have inspection, I think, twice a day. We line up, and Japanese would count us. And then we did learn about, in Santo Tomas, bowing lessons were taught late, but in Cebu, we learned very quickly how to bow. And then we were dismissed. And then we had Tenko at night too, and then we had curfew. The only light in that jail was a lantern. There was no electricity because the city was burned, and the lantern would be set in the middle of the courtyard. We'd sit around in the dust of this jail, and we would sing songs. Mostly the children would start singing, or we'd sing songs that we had learned, as we were growing up, and also World War I songs like "Over There, send the word, over there. There's a long, long trail a winding into the land of my dreams," and so on. And the Japanese didn't really realize the significance of those songs. When he sang, we could see the faces of the military men pressed against the bars listening to us. When Corregidor fell, May the 6th, the Japanese were jubilant. They came in with a newspaper announcing the fall of Corregidor. And they expected us to be very, very shocked and saddened by it. But instead, that night, we sat down in the dust of the courtyard, and we sang, and we sang. It was just as though we wanted to forget it, that now we knew that we would be in prison we wouldn't be out in a few months. We'd probably be in for a few years. So that's our realization. As far as being afraid is concerned, I think there's safety in numbers. And we had chosen as our camp leader a Catholic priest, Father William McCarthy, Maranover. He was wonderful. He had a good sense of humor. He was very calm, and he would talk to us and say, of course, he was one who said, "We pool everything. We don't keep anything for ourselves. No one has any food for himself or herself." We used to say himself in those days. And so that helped a lot. And one day, a Japanese officer came in and told us that they were being very benevolent. They were going to take us out of the jail and take us to a new place where the children would have a place to play. We remember that. And they would be going the next day. Well, actually what they needed the space for more and more of the prisoners they were taking, because of getting very crowded in the section where the prisoners were, the military prisoners. So the trucks are waiting. We get into the trucks with our meager, whatever we have, baggage, my mother and our suitcase, and we're driven to our new place. And as we're driven through the city, I look around and I see how desolate it looks. and I see a little bit of grass growing in the street, and I see this monkey with a strap and a chain and a like a chain around it. It's a monkey that is starved, half starved, running around, no people, nothing. So desolate, so quiet, so destroyed. We go up the road, La Hogue Road, and I know that we're going to pass the house, my house, and it seems like trucks going faster as we're going by this house. We're sitting on benches in this truck, flatbed truck, and then I see this big flag over the porch railing. The house, of course, is built high, as Filipino houses were in those days, and here's the Japanese flag, and I know that the Japanese are living in that house and that they have taken all our possessions. They take us to this building, which is the Junior College of the University of the Philippines. It's a 2-story cement building, had been occupied by the USAFI after the war started, and then the Japanese used it as a barracks. But when the city was destroyed, the water supply was gone, and after a while the place became so filthy that I guess they couldn't stand it, so they just moved out and let us to take over. And it was very hard to clean it up, scraping the dirt. It was unbelievably filthy. I won't describe that. But we found some of our possessions, or rather the possessions of some people who lived nearby, Americans who lived nearby. When the Japanese would cook the troops would cook their food, if the plates got dirty, they just threw them away and went into a few houses nearby and looted them, brought those clean plates in, used them and threw them away. And so people found their own couple pieces of silverware and some plates and so on. And they were so thrilled just to find a little bit of what they had left behind and thought lost forever. We were there for a while and got the place cleaned up. Then the Filipino guerrillas began to be very active in Cebu. Quite a number of guerrillas. Yeah. And
Tell us who you're talking about.
the guerrillas, Filipinos who are harassing the Japanese, and they would come down from the hills, and there would be ambushes, and sometimes the fighting was very close to us, and then we'd see the Japanese planes go and try to bomb them. Now the place that the guerrillas are coming closer and closer, so it's our feeling that the Japanese want this building back. It's a good, strong building, and we got it pretty well cleaned up. So they're moving us to another location. We don't know where, and they end up in the what they call the Club Filipino, which was a Filipino golf clubhouse made of bamboo, not a stick of wood in it, just bamboo with a nipa roof, 2-story, and looking out at an overgrown golf course. And hardly room at the junior college building. We had some little bit of room for the children, a little bit of grass area and some trees for the children to play under. Now we have nothing. It's just barbed wire all around us, and we're just in the building, and again very crowded. And
How many?
by now there are about 150, about 100. Well, actually about 150 of us now.
Start over the way.
Yes. All right. Now our numbers have swelled to about 145 people, about 20 Norwegian sailors, and many women and children. Some of the men had joined the military, so these women were taking care of the children by themselves. We had Dutch, we had British, Australian, mostly Americans, and of course the Norwegians. And I should say that everyone, as later occurred in Santo Tomas, everyone had a job. This was a well-run camp. We organized ourselves. And again, as usual, we had benko twice a day, morning and evening. But it was a little cooler where we were now, but we're more confined. We had some American priests and Dutch priests. And
have to stop for now.
ah, dear.
Okay. Now, then
Okay. Now,
this is just throwaway.
all right.
So
Okay. This
you
is
can
throwaway. So I'm.
Yeah.
So
Twinkle, twinkle, little star.
Oh, okay. Relax, relax, relax. Here we go. Now we're in.
I want you to start talking about a job or jobs that
All
you
right.
had in
Okay.
camp.
We organize ourselves. And now, the 146 of us.
Wait, back up. I'm sorry. First, let's get you to Santo Tomas.
All right.
I forgot about that.
All right. So. Eventually, we found ourselves in the largest civilian camp in the Philippines, Santo Tomas Internment Camp in Manila. There were 146 of us arrived there, and it seemed such a huge place. We hadn't seen the beginning of this camp because we weren't there the first year when the camp was being organized. And to us, it seems so incredible. Here were all these people, and they seemed to be, well, they didn't seem as though they were interned in a certain respect because they didn't have dinko as we had. They were, in the beginning, of course, they had been under guard, and they had suffered privation, and they had suffered the problem of getting food. But now, things had fallen into place. They had an organizational system. Everyone had a job, just as we did in Cebu. All of us had a job there. And right away, I found that I could meet people that were my age. In Cebu, as a teenager, I only had one person who was close in age to me, and all the others were much younger children. And of course, there were adults. But here there are older teenagers, as I was. Had turned 18 while in Cebu. I was in a room with about 40 women and children, girls, teenage girls, and then some younger boys, maybe as young as 6 years of age. And the younger children, much younger, were in a separate building called the Annex. These were mothers with small babies. And then there was a large main building. That's where I was, 3 stories. Actually, it was a 4th story, but there were no rooms there except open-aired rooms where eventually we would have some classes because we would have school in Santo Tomas. And I was in a 3rd floor room, as I said, with 40 women and children. And the rooms, I might say, none of the rooms had doors that open and shut. They only had curtains. And people assigned to those rooms were the only ones allowed to enter those rooms. No one else could. And so if you had a friend who had come and wanted to talk to you, they had to ask someone to go in and get you, someone who was assigned to that room, and then then you could go out and talk to your friend. So that was one way of keeping overcrowding, or perhaps having people coming in and just make things more and more difficult and crowded, because beds or cots or slat beds were very close to one another. Well, right away, of course, we had jobs right within the room itself. We had room cleaning twice a week. In case of room 55A, on Tuesdays and Fridays, and there was a list posted of what each person in the room was to do. That would be the teenage girls and the women. And that would mean taking everything from under your cot or bed and putting it on your bed so we could sweep the floor and then eventually mop. And then we would scrub the window sills or the windows. If there were shelves, we would dust those. We tried to keep everything as clean as could be. The younger children, and it was kind of interesting, we even let the little children have a job. The job was called dust can duty. That sounds strange to call it dust can, when we would call it a waste paper basket. But we posted a list of those who had dust can duty, the little children. Every Monday, a little child in our room would take the dust can and set it outside the door to be emptied into a large container down the hall, and then every day these containers throughout camp were emptied. The camp was really kept quite clean. You didn't see any litter anywhere. I mean, it was very clean. No one would dare discard anything on the floor or on the grounds. We had to do that because there were so many people in our camp, as many as 5,000. I would imagine 4,000 to 5,000. I don't know if my figures are right there, but it seemed like there was a lot of people. Where else would we stay besides the main building, which was an earthquake-proof building? Very, very well built. There was another building called the Education Building, and in this building were teenage boys and men. And then we had, on the opposite side of this large campus of the University of Santo Tomas, we had the Education Building. And in this, excuse me, not Education Building, I mean the gymnasium. And in the gym were men who were perhaps Spanish-American War veterans whose Filipino families were on the outside. They were not interned. Priests, young men, those who were not married or did not have families. In some cases they did, but in most cases they were single men or men whose families were not with them in the camp. Finally, we had another building called the Annex. This is a building for families with small babies and children. I don't know if I mentioned that just previously or not. Did I? I might have done that. But anyway, then of course, because of the overcrowding, when I arrived at Santo Tomas, I saw all these shanties. And they had Shantytown and they had all kinds of names. And really and truly, I was not allowed to go into those areas where the shanties were. And I remember one time I had a friend, a teenage friend, who told me, I'll take you through my area, and she showed me around her area. So you just didn't go into anyone's shanty without permission, just like you would go into a room that was not assigned to you. There had to be that type of situation in a very crowded time that we had to spend. Now, as far as work is concerned, other duties, we had bathroom duty, which meant that women in my room, some of the women were assigned to make sure that the women's bathroom down the hall was kept clean. You can imagine how many people would use that bathroom. And so they would check on it to be sure it was clean. Then we had vegetable cleaning duty. And almost every woman and teenage girl who did not have a regular camp job was assigned to vegetable duty. And that meant that you went down outside under some sheds where baskets of vegetables, they could be camotes, which are native sweet potatoes, were brought in, and sometimes some greens, some of which were grown in Santo Tomas in the gardens which had been established. And you would sit down and you would have a little knife, a paring knife, and you would sit and you were given you would work on vegetables perhaps maybe an hour in the morning, or maybe longer than that if you wished, and you would scrape the vegetables, making sure that the peelings were very thin. There was always a man who would go up and down watching you to be sure that you were not taking the peelings off too thickly. And you'd take the rotten spots out and you'd put those into a basket to discard those, and then into another basket would be the peeled camotes, which would be used for the food. You would take the rice and you would put it in a flat basket, and then you would go through it and you'd pick out little bits of sand or dirt, little beetles and so on, make sure the rice is clean. It would be poured into a basket to be taken to the central kitchen where it would be cooked by the cooks. And as I remember, there were no women who cooked the food in the central kitchen. They were all men because it was such a heavy job to prepare food for so many people, over 3,000 who would be passing through the line to get their food. And then, of course, there would be some fresh greens. We had a kind of a native spinach called talinum, which we grew in the camp before I arrived in Santo Tomas. Because there was a shortage of food and the Japanese were not feeding the internees, just like they never ever fed us in Cebu. We had to rely on our friends on the outside for food. They established gardens. They dug this university.
Okay.
Have you skipped that one?
Yes. So we're now talking about they had gardens.
All right, now.
Actually, we're finished with gardens because that was good. And we can show the gardens. What I would love to have you talk about now,
They
that was
established
jobs, and you said you went to school. Was there any social life?
All
Were
right.
there dances or sporting events or...
Now, you see, I was not into that.
games?
There were.
Okay.
I'm not into that because I was not athletically inclined.
But you could tell what other teenagers did.
All right.
Or you could
Now,
say, I didn't do those things, but...
others did. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is that I didn't mention the fact that we could take the peelings home. Peelings.
Oh, right. Okay, so...
And I did work in the gardens. That was one of my jobs.
Okay. But
Right.
you have to start from the beginning and say, when we were on vegetable duty, and we
All
had
right,
peeled all
okay.
these vegetables, we could take the peelings home.
All right, okay.
So, start like that.
All right. And you have eliminated that.
Okay?
All right. And I haven't said anything about digging up the gardens yet.
Right.
And I'm not going to mention that.
Okay.
All right. Those of us on vegetable duty, after we finished peeling the vegetables or cutting out rotten spots or cutting the ends off of native spinach called talinum, we were allowed to help ourselves to whatever we would call the, sometimes in the end we used to call it the refuse because it was just inedible. It would take several hours of just scraping those peelings to get anything that we could use for supplementing our food that we got off the central kitchen line. And speaking of the central kitchen line, when we walked through line, we had each been issued a meal ticket. And these meal tickets are interesting. I have several that I saved. And they were recycled because paper was so scarce that they were printed by someone who had I guess you would call it a mimeograph machine, or I don't know what kind of a printing machine it was, but one man was responsible for making all these. And we would have one issued, say, this is the month of February, all right. We would have February and then the year and then all the days in that particular month, 28 or maybe leap year. And then as we started down the line, there was always a man who would punch the tickets to be sure that he would, with a little paper punch, would punch out, say, February the 1st. Then we go through the line with our tin can with a wire handle, and someone behind the counter would give us a scoop of rice, mush, or soup. But if it was rice, she or he would take the scoop, level it off with a wooden paddle, spatula, and then put it into our can that we were carrying, and then we would go on down the line. And if we had another food item, we might have a plate, and they would put something on that. And then we would take it to the dining sheds where we would sit and eat. The people in shanties, of course, could prepare their own food if they wished and supplement what they could grow around their shanties. We had the camp gardens, and I liked to work in the garden, so I signed up for garden duty. And 7 o'clock in the morning, I was starting out with maybe a little bowl of mush for my breakfast. And now I'm on my way to do the planting. I would be given a basket of talinum, which is a native spinach. I'd have a planting stick, would put the stick into make a hole in the ground, lean over, put a cutting into the earth, pressed by the earth around, being careful I wouldn't cut myself with any broken glass. It could be a garbage dump at one time. There was a lot of broken glass and debris in the soil. And hopefully that the rains would come and these talinum would start to take root and grow, and then we could come another time and we would harvest this by cutting off the tops and putting them in a basket to be carried off to the central kitchen. And there was we grew camotes, the native sweet potatoes, but generally we didn't eat the camotes themselves. We ate the vines and the leaves. And these, of course, would be cut, and camotes would tend to make your fingers turn sort of black. They would stain your fingers, but that didn't matter. You could always scrub that off. And the vines were cut, and the leaves were placed in stems were placed in a pot, and that would be the basis of a soup with any other ingredients that might be added. And at least it was, though there were no calories to speak of, at least we felt we were getting vitamins. Food was a problem. The camp had buyers, Filipino buyers, who would go out and to buy the food. And of course, camp funds, there was money that had to be paid for the food, and how the money was raised was another story. But I'll just say that for a while we had adequate food, although people were losing weight all the time. There was insufficient items such as meat was in short supply. By May of 1944, things had come to a terrible state. I remember I was writing in my diary that I had never seen so many thin children and men whose collarbones stuck out, and the women who looked so tired and disheveled and had stopped caring about their looks because they were so tired and weak. I said, there's no milk, no meat, no fruits, hardly any vegetables, and really no salt, no sugar. It was very, very difficult time. And we had received only once, had we received from the American Red Cross what we would call shipment of food, comfort kits as we called them. We had received earlier, just shortly before that, we received a comfort kit from the Canadian Red Cross and the South African Red Cross. Not very much, but it was really something that we needed desperately. So the end of 1943 was the one and only time that we received anything from the American Red Cross. Actually, the food had been sent to us, but that was the only time that it was allowed in, and we didn't get all of it. Because as I understand, some of this food appeared in Manila and was being sold in the black market. I won't go into detail about that. Some people were so hungry for these foods. Little tins of butter and little containers of coffee and little containers of jam, that they could hardly wait to taste all these wonderful things, and before long they had nothing. Some people sold the contents of their comfort kit such as the men in the Ed building who were Spanish-American War veterans. Many of them sold the contents of their comfort kits so they could get money to give to their families on the outside. For some people, like my family, we decided we were not going to touch any of this. We were going to wait until the time came when we would have nothing. And when things got very difficult, we began to open a can now and then. And people shared their food. We used to share ours with other people. Sometimes we sort of adopt a family or a couple of friends who didn't have anything, and we would share with them. People were really very generous. I didn't see much greed or not much at all in the camp. They were very aware of one another. And I remember when we got so weak, there was, and the sugar that came in the kits were in little sugar cubes, the kind that you don't see that too often today, that you would drop a sugar cube into a cup of coffee. But you don't see that anymore. And just to put a sugar cube in your mouth, you'd feel all that energy all of a sudden. And I remember that sometimes we would give these sugar cubes to some of our friends who were really very tired and weak. But I enjoyed being outside doing the garden, although it did leave me kind of shaky after I'd been working for about an hour. I was always working on vegetable duty too. Another job I had was scrubbing the bathroom, cleaning the bathroom. I decided I'd try that once. So to clean the bathroom, there were two of us girls. We'd go in, and not every day, but a couple of days a week was our turn, and we would take ashes, wood ashes, and we would use that for scrubbing. And that, of course, your hands became kind of raw sometimes, but it worked. And with school, we had 3 first-grade classes in Santo Tomas. Lack of books, so we made flashcards to teach spelling and reading. And we'd hold those up. So I learned to print, and using, as I can remember, it would be, we didn't have magic markers, so it would be something like a crayon or perhaps a brush with ink. And we had the first grade class, and I was an assistant for one of the first grade teachers. That lasted for about a year. And I was also taking some courses. I had been in high school when the war started, and I wanted to finish high school, and there were some high school classes, and so I signed up for some, and I actually, you might say, graduated. They gave me a little diploma. We had a graduation ceremony, and I was given a diploma, handmade, with the picture of the tower drawn on it, and University of Santo Tomas. I still have that. Then later on, I signed up for a few other classes. Again, no books. I wanted to take Latin. So there were 3 of us, and there was one woman that said she would teach us Latins. And of course, we would take the book, and we would take it to our room, and we would translate. We were a page or 2, and then we would give the book to the other person who was taking the same class, Latin class, and pass it on. And then we would meet with our teacher. This was a very informal thing, really no grade given for this, and we would translate from Latin to English, or vice versa, which was more difficult. And Spanish, I enjoyed Spanish. Sitting outside, about 3 or 4 of us, just informally speaking Espanol. And eventually I did major in Spanish when I went to college in the States, because I had some background, some of it in Santo Tomas. What other jobs? Well,
instead of jobs, how about something about, even if social life wasn't
all
your
right,
social
okay,
life,
all right.
what events?
Okay, I'll do that. All right. Well, we tried to make life as normal as possible. So we had a stage called the Little Theater Under the Stars. It was a stage. And we would give programs. There was a man there, Dave Harvey, and he usually organized these programs which would be given, and people would come out and they would bring their folding chairs or little stools and sit down to watch the program that was given. And sometimes we gave little, well, you might call them like a radio show play. And I have the script to one of those. It's kind of funny. And we had little, we would have a little chorus. And if a person could sing or even perform a dance, like there was one woman who was quite acrobatic and she could perform, she would occasionally, a program would be given, and it would be sort of something funny, and they would try to slip something that was patriotic, hoping the Japanese wouldn't catch on. But one time, the Japanese did catch on, and the person in charge was, because he was called to the commandant's office to explain what he meant by what he said. And I must mention this too, that there was a broadcast, there was a loudspeaker where we got our instructions, or you might say, the commandant wanted us to do, or what we were supposed to do, would be broadcast to us on this speaker system. So, and over this we would hear music. It would be played and we could hear it in the front of the main building. So in the evening, we could sit out in the evening after our so-called supper and listen to music. And sometimes it was music that was classical music, sometimes popular music, tunes, but nothing really patriotic, although a couple times patriotic music was played, and one time it reached as far as Bilibid prison, which was not too far away from us. The wind happened to be blowing in that direction, and we heard that we were never ever to do that again, because the prisoners in Bilibid heard it and they were very excited. So that was something that you had to be aware of.
Okay. My name is Robert Fredrickson, Robert A. Fredrickson, Greensboro, North Carolina. And I'm the husband of Jane Fredrickson, who was a prisoner of war, civilian prisoner of war, in the Philippines in World War II. Jane and I met in school at Penn State. I was coming back after the war, after spending some time in Europe, and resuming my education in my junior year. And I didn't meet Jane until my senior year. And she had started school there after coming back, and was working straight through, trying to finish up her schooling in 3 years. I met her at a sock hop, which means that we were out at a dance. And Jane and I met there, and then we married in 1948, in the August of 48, and then moved up to New Hampshire, where I had my first teaching job. Jane was not used to cold weather. I've been in the Philippines, and I can still remember at the end of that year, Jane had 4 words for me: "Get me out of here." It was too much for her, and she had a wild time. She had a job over in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and took a bus along with others who worked at this particular place, and the bus would break down in the middle of nowhere, and it was cold, and she wasn't used to it. So we had no job that second year. We moved down to where it was warmer, moved down to North Carolina. Jane, I found, didn't talk much about the war. She wanted to forget it, and of course that's typical, I think, of a lot of the men and the women who came out of World War II who were directly involved in the war. And even her students, when she became a teacher, she never told her students that she had been a prisoner of war. I don't think anyone ever knew, even her colleagues. And but it showed up at home in interesting ways. We saved everything. It was as if she was going through that experience of the war. Every little thing was important. When you're a prisoner, of course, you don't throw anything away. It has a use, a possible use. You don't have much as a prisoner, but what you do have, you guard it very carefully and save it. And I think we did that too. I think probably I was the same way in that being a teacher as well. There were things that I wanted to keep, and I never knew if I was going to use them. Teachers both have they have a double life, don't they? They have a life at home, and then they have a life in school, and their teaching materials are important, and they bring them home and they work out them over the week and over the weekend. And if you're teaching in certain fields like social studies, you could be teaching in the area of psychology, history, geography, government, and all these areas of the social sciences. And so as they move around from one thing or another, you save your materials because you're going to use them again. Well, Jane was the same way. So she knew the value of things, having been a prisoner and having been somebody who didn't have much. She realized the importance of frugality and the importance of taking care of yourself and your health. And we lived simply. We enjoyed doing that.
Sorry, stick back in the they just
Did she go by?
Did
Did she? Oh, Dick. I thought it was Jane. Jane might be over there, is she?
Oh,
Is she hiding over there? Get her out of there. Oh, dear. Hey, hon, what are you doing? Go in there and sit down, dear.
telling wonderful stories, but I can see that he's self-conscious.
Harry, what do you think? Is there something that you want me to say here? Am I on the right track?
Yeah, we do.
And be sure to come in with some questions, too.
Okay.
Don't feel free to do that. Will help me a little bit, too. Let's see. I think generally Jane, again through her war experiences, has been very sensitive to the needs of others. Having grown up in the Philippines until she was, she left as a prisoner. I think she was coming home at age 21, I believe. And she knew the Filipinos well, and she understood the difficulty of life in the Philippines, because Philippines people live very simply, and she could appreciate their culture and appreciate their needs. So she was very sensitive. I found that even some of her friends are almost a carbon copy of Jane. It's interesting, sometimes amusing. We husbands sometimes talk about this. Talk about our wives and say, how come they're all like the same? What, they're shaped by their experience, I guess. Certainly we all are.
Do you think she was bitter? Was she bitter about anything?
Was she bitter? No, I think she was, the term bitter perhaps might be a little strong. She was certainly, angry is less than bitter, I think. She was angry as she thought about the way the Japanese treated the Americans. And she was in a small camp at first in Cebu, 2 or 3 camps in Cebu. And there was more direct contact with the Japanese, and they slapped people around, and they did things that were unnecessary. And I think this bothered her. So angry probably is the word rather than bitter. I don't think she was ever bitter. There was a long time she couldn't tolerate really having a person of Japanese descent or a background in the house, visiting the house. Now, when I taught overseas one year, I had a very good friend who was Japanese American from Hawaii. And Roy, I don't think ever knew that Jane was a prisoner of war and knew about their experience. And Roy was, he was Japanese descent, but he certainly wasn't anyone that Jane would not want to be with. He was different. But she felt very uncomfortable from others because of that experience of hers. So bitter, no, but angry and disturbed, and of course she understood that the modern generation is another thing. If you think about the history of the Japanese people in recent times, the changeover and the shoguns of recent times, they began to change. They began to modernize, and yet the military was still in control. And as a result, the people of Japan during World War II were under the military and were very strictly guided in their thought and their behavior. And yet after the war, the remarkable thing that I think was helped by General MacArthur in changing the nature of the government, and yet keeping the emperor was important, which he did. But the Japanese culture changed. When we've been to Japan, we've been a couple of times passing through, we've noticed that the older Japanese are still many of them are still the old mind, old set. And that's understandable too, but very noticeable. What else can I say? Our two children never heard much about their mother and the experiences she went through. I think after we retired, we became more interested in trying to find friends of those war years. And Jane has found a lot of them. She became known as the connector because she would connect people together. Oh, I know where that person is. And she would bring others together. And she has a marvelous memory of that time, mostly positive. I'm sure a lot of the misery or the difficult times have been pushed to one side. There's been no problem living with this woman. She's a marvelous person, and I respect her for what she's gone through. What else can I say? Another
I
question.
don't know. I think that was very nice. I think that will do. That was very nice. Yeah, it says great things about Jane, but it also is general enough to capture, sort of what might apply to a lot of other people. And your comment about the husbands, oh my gosh, they're all alike.
Yeah, funny. There's a gal in Colorado, and when I get together with her husband, they laugh about that. They can stand at the kitchen sink together and do and say the same things to behave as if they're sisters. It's so funny, interesting, and we laugh about it.